So it's come that time. It's time for our stories to come to an end. We've spent a week writing beginnings and a week writing middles, and now it's time to write the endings of our September 11th historical fiction stories. So what do you need to do? Go through these slides. On Tuesday, you'll write chapter 5, and on Wednesday, you'll write your last chapter, chapter 6. Which part of the story is the ending? Well, in our stories, these will be 2 chapters, and each problem from the middle should get resolved at the end of the story. You must use action, thinking, dialogue, or feeling to show the lesson that your main character learns. Now, you don't have to come out and say, and so he learned blah, blah, blah. You can show us that change. You can show us that realization for the character. This is once again our slide that reminds us of the things that should happen in the beginning, middle, and end. So of course the end includes the following action and resolution of a story. We resolve the problems, we teach a lesson through the way our main character changes, and we connect to the beginning and to the heart of the story. So let's begin to write our end with all of our tools. You have your pre-writing, your story arc, historical context, character, dialogue, the heart of the story. We've used those 5 things to help us write the beginning and the middle as well. But now we have part of our draft. We have the beginning and the middle. So I'm going to show you how we can use these 7 tools to write a great ending. From my story arc, I go ahead and copy paste that 5th and 6th moment. So I can start from working with my story arc. Now, from the historical context, I'm thinking a little bit more globally at this point because now the 2 planes have already crashed. So we're not so focused on the news in this moment because Brian, number 1, hasn't seen the news, and number 2, he's in New York. He isn't as affected by the crash in Pennsylvania or Washington, D.C. So I don't want my characters to know what we know now. As we look back on this story, we'll understand the weight of September 11th and what happened on that day. But they're living in the moment, and they don't necessarily understand all of that yet. So to make chapter 5 more realistic, I think Stanley should get medical attention, and Brian should get to go home after getting checked out. So this is just a part where I'm trying to make sure, he was bleeding out of his leg and he needed a tourniquet and all of that. And for him to walk away from that would be not so realistic. Remember that historical fiction stories are always realistic, even though elements are imagined. In chapter 6, I realized that there's a moment where they're seeing the news on TV, and this is the first time Brian has seen the news of the day. So he probably hasn't even seen all those images of what everything looks like. Okay, I'm going back to Brian's character, and I want to think about character in the ending. I want to show how my characters have changed. So I want Stanley to remember how he started out, crumpled in that corner, wondering if anyone would even stop and help him. And now, on the flip side, he's really changed. He's optimistic and he has a new life. Brian has also changed, and we know a big part of his change is getting that new brother. When he started, he was an only child, and now he's got a brother. Finally, I can use my scene. Remember that this scene that I created with dialogue belonged in the 5th chapter? Well, I'm going to put it right in there. So I've just put add dialogue scene here. That little note is for me. Remember that as we're going through this thinking of how we can use our pre-writing, you're doing what you need to write your best story. So it's okay to kind of talk to yourself in your notes. I want to think about how dialogue is going to work in chapter 6. In chapter 6 is the first time we actually meet Cynthia. We've seen her in a flashback when Brian was thinking about his wedding, but this is the first time we actually hear her and could potentially hear her speak. So I want to see how her dialogue can help us get to know her and help us understand why she and Brian have been such a good match. The heart of the story. Remembering that in this story, what I want Brian to learn is the importance of family, okay? That family is really everything for him. So in chapter 5, I'm going to kind of give that with gratitude, helping them kind of give thanks in that moment, showing those first responders coming to their aid, and of course, Brian and Stanley thanking each other. And then in order to show the theme in the last chapter, I'm thinking about Maybe Cynthia's talk reminds us of the type of day they thought they would have, about his big presentation of what he thought was important. And we see that kind of contrast with the things that we now know are important because of this big tragic day. So, of course, I have my chapter 1 and chapter 2. How can I connect my ending to the beginning? That's what I'm thinking about. Now, when I think about how to connect my ending, I'm really focused on chapter 6. So I remember that in the beginning, he was pouring coffee, and maybe Cynthia can give him coffee as a way to care for him. Also, it's a little bit funny because he never actually got to drink his coffee. Remember, he left it in the bathroom. So this is actually his first cup of coffee of the day. Boy, did he need coffee to get through this. And I remember in the first chapter of the story, it ended with him rejecting a call from his dad. Maybe at the end, he chooses to call his dad because he's putting family first and he's tying up those loose ends. So, of course, next was the middle. And in the middle, I'm really thinking about the problems that I created. And I want to use chapter 5 to solve those problems. So the first problem was that that we didn't know if Stanley was going to make it because Stanley was hurt. So I want to add a little bit more about kind of their physical pain and make it realistic where we're resolving that pain. So we need some paramedics to come in. Maybe they can get oxygen or something like that to help them because, of course, they've had smoke and inhalation and all sorts of injuries. And then I'm also going to add Brian taking a taxi home because obviously he's walked down dozens of flights of stairs. There's no way he can walk to the subway at this point. Adrenaline was really helping him when the crisis was there. But once he gets out of the building, I think he's going to realize how tired he is. And then another one of the problems was that Stanley was a stranger and Brian didn't really know what he needed or how to help him. But now they've made this connection and he has these tools. So I just want to remind you, you're going to use those 7 things we've already done to help build a great ending. And as you're doing it, I want you to zoom out and think of the things that we know belong in great endings. We need to have closure. The problems get solved at the end of the story. So make sure you make that connection, check those 2 problems you added in chapter 3 and chapter 4, and make sure you provide a realistic solution. In the theme, we need to see that the main character learns a lesson. You don't have to tell us, but you should show us. The story should feel complete. The end needs to connect to the beginning. And we can connect it through imagery. We can connect it through repetition. There's a lot of ways to make that connection. And finally, we want to tell our story in a dynamic way. We want to balance the action, dialogue, thinking, and feeling so that our story doesn't have too much or too little of any of them. We don't just want to hear, and then he felt, and then she felt, and then he felt, and then she felt, right? And we don't want to hear, and then she said, and then he said, or and then they did, and then they did. We want some differences in there, some variety to keep the story interesting. So remember, your task is, after watching this presentation and reviewing the slides, to write your chapter 5 and write your chapter 6. Now I'm going to go in and read your mentor texts. The end of Brian's story. Chapter 5, Give Me a Call. Stanley and Brian emerged from the smoldering tower. Dust filled their lungs, but they were so happy to finally see the light. Brian's shoulder didn't even feel sore where Stanley had been leaning on it for the last 58 floors. "Thank you, brother," Stanley coughed to Brian as a tear rolled down his cheek. "I can't believe we made it out," Brian replied. "Oh no, the debris is falling. We need to get out of here." The men ran a 3-legged race across the street. Out of breath, they stopped and smiled at one another. Brian hugged Stanley and whispered, "Until today, I was an only child. Today and forever, you are my brother." Paramedics approached the men. They wrapped them in aluminum blankets and provided oxygen masks. Brian offered his hurt shoulder, which a paramedic put in a sling. Stanley would need to stay with them longer for his leg, so he bid farewell to his new friend, his new brother. "In that stairwell, I almost gave up." "You gave me new life." Stanley passed Brian a business card, which had remained surprisingly clean in his pocket. "My cell is on the back. Give me a call when you can." Brian smiled and nodded as he flagged down a bright yellow taxi cab with his good arm. He was far too tired to take the subway home today. Chapter 6. I Thought of You. Cynthia sat in the armchair of their apartment living room, waiting, wondering, and worrying as she watched the news. She had turned it on this morning before heading to work, just to check the weather, when she saw the unimaginable. A plane striking the World Trade Center? All of the questions had rushed through her head this morning, but most of all she worried about Brian. She heard the doorknob turn over clumsily. Could it be? She pondered, suddenly hopeful. She muted the TV and rushed to the door. It was there she encountered her soulmate, her husband of 25 years. He was a bit dirty and had a sling, but he was alive and home. Brian opened his mouth to speak, but nothing came out. His lips trembled and tears streamed down his face. "Oh, my love, sit down." She sat him down in the armchair. "I've got coffee for you." Brian glanced at the screen with disbelief. Almost reading his mind, Cynthia responded, "And to think, you left home today so worried about your presentation." She returned with the coffee, which she sat down on the end table. "I'm just so relieved that you're home. How did you make it out?" she whispered. He locked eyes with her earnestly. "I thought of you on our wedding day. I thought of everyone who mattered to me," Brian confessed. "Today, I got something better than a promotion. I have a brother now. I'm an only child, no more." He handed her the crumpled business card. "Stanley's headed to the hospital, but he'll make it. We made it out of there. This week, I want to call him, invite him to Thanksgiving." She nodded supportively. "But first, I need to make a call," Brian said as he opened his cell phone to contact Dad. Now, that's the end of my story. I hope that you enjoyed how I introduced the characters and the setting, how I found problems and built on them to really show the exciting, huge emergency in this story. And finally, we resolved those problems and showed how Brian learned a lesson, how he changed, how his actions changed, how his feelings changed, and how we ended up in this story. Now it's your turn. Do the same. End your September 11th historical fiction story. What can we learn from that time period? What can the past teach us in lessons for today? Thanks.